Form our present and inspire our future. It is about learning from the wisdom of those who blaze new frontiers and embrace the responsibility to keep pushing forward. As scholars, educators, and learners, we are all part of the continuum. This afternoon, you will be hearing from two distinguished scholars who have embodied the ideals of our college as dedicated champions of improving educational practice and policies. They have managed to work through the challenges in their own way, transforming them from challenges into opportunities. Their insights through their work have challenged us to think critically, act boldly, and ensure that the lessons from their storied past continues to guide the college mission towards a better tomorrow. For in time, we will all be in moments of transitions and will reflect upon our own experiences and wonder how we will be remembered. I invite you all to think about where we have been and where we are going in this time of change in higher education, given the challenges that we now face, and how each of us might be able to contribute to that effort and the journey. At this time, I would like to invite David Bloom, Professor Emeritus, to the podium. Dr. Bloom graciously served as our inaugural lecturer at the 2023 New Legacy Lecture Series for the College of Education and Human Ecology. He joins us this afternoon to welcome and introduce our first presenter, Dr. Bloom.
It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Evelyn B. Freeman. Evelyn B. Freeman. I'm sure she would want us to simply call her Evie. There are a number of people who are known by their first names only. Beyoncé, Cher, Michelangelo, and Evie. And there are good reasons why Evie should be known simply by her first name. I could introduce Evie by telling you about all the leadership positions she has held, including Dean and Director at OSU Mansfield, Director of the School of Teaching and Learning here at OSU, President of the International Board of Books for Young People, President of NCTE Children's Literature Assembly, and Octella, but I won't introduce her that way. Or I could introduce Evie by telling you about the 60-plus journal articles she wrote, her 2 books, numerous book chapters, her editorship of professional journals, and numerous other academic accomplishments, but I won't tell you about that either. Or I could introduce Evie by telling you about the hundreds of students she has influenced and who have gone on as teachers in early childhood classrooms and in teacher education programs to bring children's literature to children and to teachers. Or I could talk about her long affiliation with OSU, which started in 1976 when she was a doctoral student here, and continued as professor and administrator until she retired in 2014. Or I could introduce her by listing her numerous awards, including the prestigious Distinguished Service Award from NCTE, and the Alita Cuts Lifetime Membership Award from USBBY. But I won't do any of that. I'd prefer to introduce Evie another way. So let me start by introducing Evie with a radical idea that I believe is a driving force in her life, both in the education profession and in her personal life as well. The idea? Stories matter. Stories matter whether the stories are fiction or nonfiction, whether they are published or passed around from person to person. Stories are what make us human. Stories are what makes a collection of individuals a community. Stories are what make the difference between transactional relationships and caring relationships. Yet, there has been an effort to strip the education of our youngest students of stories. Stories of their lives, of their families, of their histories, stories of the lives of others, stories that provoke them to imagine new worlds and worlds of possibilities, stories that bring people together, stories that bridge divide, and stories that express unity and inclusion. Evie, among others, of course, has called out and stood in the way of the erosion of story from the lives and education of children. Stories matter. This is what Evie brought to OSU, to early childhood education, both nationally and internationally. She was not alone in this, of course, and this is so typical of Evie, bringing together people to assert and make manifest that stories matter. There are indeed many reasons why Evie should be known simply by her first name, and I am honored to have the pleasure of introducing Evie.
My step stool. Thank you, David, for that quite amazing introduction. Thank you to Dean Pope Davis, Dr. Luthi, and the Dean's staff for this honor. Thank you to my colleagues, friends, former students, and family for being here today, and those watching the live stream. I would like to tell you a story. We didn't plan this. David and I didn't plan this, but I would like to tell you a story about a teacher who believes that books can bring joy and comfort and possess the power to change lives. A story about a teacher who desires to share books with children in classrooms in order to enrich the curriculum. First slide, please. A story that reflects a teacher's 50-year journey. And as I only have 15 minutes to tell you this story, my story, I will share only a few highlights of this journey. I cannot remember a time when I wasn't reading and writing. I was very fortunate to grow up in a home surrounded by books. Both my parents were avid readers, and they read to me frequently when I was a child. I was editor of my junior high and high school newspapers. I taught creative writing in an after-school program in Pittsburgh as part of my undergraduate work-study scholarship. So it was probably no surprise to those who knew me that I became a teacher and a professor of language arts and children's literature. My professional story begins in 1971, when I started teaching at Urban Crest Elementary School, a segregated black school in the Southwestern City School District. My time at Urban Crest holds a very special place in my heart. The school, long closed, is currently the Union Baptist Church, and one of my former Urban Crest students is its pastor. Another of my Urban Crest students, Grace McDaniel, was the last PhD student I advised. But let us return to the beginning of this story. Next slide. Chapter 1, Literature Across the Curriculum and Nonfiction Children's Literature. As a teacher, I wanted to share folk tales, realistic and historical fiction, picture books, poetry, and nonfiction to support the teaching of reading and content area curriculum. This idea of using children's books to support reading instruction or to supplement content area textbooks was just beginning to germinate in education circles. At that time, many believed that the meaning of the text resided in the text itself, leading to the conclusion that there is just one best way to interpret a text. Comprehension questions emphasize the one right answer about the theme of the book, the plot, the characters, and other aspects of the text. In 1978, Louise Rosenblatt wrote her now classic work, The Reader, the Text, the Poem, the Transactional Theory of the Literary Work, in which she posited that each reader brings their own meaning to a text based on factors such as background knowledge and personal experiences. Reading, she believed, is not a passive activity, but a transaction between the reader and the text. Therefore, a written text does not carry the same meaning for everyone. Rosenblatt became synonymous with reader response theory, which gave rise to the value and importance of children discussing books together, sharing their thoughts, asking questions about the text, and bringing deeper meaning to the written word. Children could respond to books in multiple meaningful ways, such as through discussion, writing, art, drama, music, and even cooking. Next slide. My journey brought me to Ohio State when I entered the PhD program in 1976. The children's literature program at OSU was in the forefront of advocating that children's literature could be shared across the curriculum and in supporting Rosenblatt's ideas about reader response. Charlotte Huck and Janet Hickman began the OSU Children's Literature Conference in the early 1980s. When Charlotte retired in 1986, Rudine Sims Bishop and Janet co-directed the conference. It continued until 2004 and drew as many as 2,000 teachers and teacher educators from across the country, all eager to hear from authors and illustrators and to attend sessions on ways to share and use children's literature in the classroom. During the late 80s and early 90s, when I was teaching children's literature and coordinating the education program at the Newark campus, I, along with the other 3 regional campus children's literature professors, organized a one-day conference that was hosted on a different regional campus each year. OSU developed a graduate course on literature across the curriculum, which paid special emphasis to informational books and biographies. I taught this class on a regular basis. In the 1970s and 80s, nonfiction was considered the stepchild of fiction and picture books. A paucity of professional literature about using nonfiction in classrooms was available. A group of us in the National Council of Teachers of English shared an interest in advocating for nonfiction and promoting its relationship to the elementary curriculum. We believed nonfiction had myriad possibilities to support content area learning, serve as mentor text for writing and research, help children learn to read informational text and graphics, and respond to children's own curiosity in knowing about special topics. Partially due to our efforts, NCTE created the Committee on Using Nonfiction in the Elementary Language Arts Classroom. Next slide. This committee recommended the creation of the Orbis Pictus Award for Outstanding Nonfiction for Children, which NCTE established in 1989. The award was named for Johannes Amos Comenius's Orbis Pictus, The World in Pictures, published in 1658 and considered to be the first book actually planned for children. I had the honor of being selected the first chair of both the NCTE Committee on Using Nonfiction and the Orbis Pictus Award Committee, working with dedicated, wonderful colleagues from across the U.S. Next slide. The first award was presented in 1990 to The Great Little Madison by Jean Fritz. In 1991, it was awarded to Franklin Delano Roosevelt by Russell Freeman. Both Fritz and Friedman, early greats in the field of nonfiction, elevated the quality of biography and informational books. Friedman, known for his meticulous research, incorporated archival photos in his books. Fritz humanized her subjects, describing their lives in a lighthearted, humorous manner. Next slide. In 1992, the award went to Flight, a book about the journey of Charles Lindbergh, written by Robert Burley with gorgeous illustrations by Mike Wimmer. This award was one of the first major recognitions of the informational picture book and its value to children of all ages, not only the very young. The changes in nonfiction and the growth of the Orbis Pictus Award since those very early years have been very exciting to witness. Picture book biographies and informational books for children of all ages have grown in popularity and variety. The visual elements of books have become increasingly important. Biographies have evolved to include books about women, people of color, and ordinary people who have done extraordinary or unusual, interesting things. The Committee on Using Nonfiction was also charged by NCTE to produce a publication for teachers. Committee members and others contributed to the edited book using nonfiction trade books in the elementary classroom, from ants to zeppelins, published by NCTE in 1992. It is one of the first professional books about nonfiction in the classroom. Today, professional books, journal articles, and conference presentations about nonfiction in the classroom are abundant. Next slide. Chapter 2, Diversity in Children's Literature. While teaching at Urban Crest, I wanted to share books in which my students could see themselves in the pages of the book. In the early 1970s, this was not an easy task, since there was little emphasis on diversity in children's literature. Nancy Larrick's 1965 seminal article for Saturday Review, titled The All-White World of Children's Books, brought attention to the need for diversity in children's literature. Larrick, with others, founded the Council on Interracial Books for Children in 1966. In 1969, the American Library Association established the Coretta Scott King Book Award to honor outstanding African American artists and illustrators. In 1975, the Children's Book Press became the first independent press in the United States to publish books by and about people of color. Change was slowly beginning, and more attention was focused on the importance of diversity in children's literature. Next slide. In 1990, our OSU colleague Rudine Sims Bishop published her influential work, Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors. This metaphor has become a major force in children's literature. Rudine believed that children need books that are mirrors so they can see themselves in the book, windows to provide them a view of people unlike themselves, and sliding glass doors so they can walk into a new world and become immersed in it. Over the years, as I taught multicultural children's literature to graduate students, once even having the privilege of team teaching it with Rudine, from whom I learned so much, the field grew with new children's book awards highlighting books about various diverse groups, and publishers establishing imprints dedicated to books by authors and illustrators of color. In 2014, a grassroots group established We Need Diverse Books, a nonprofit organization that advocates changes in publishing to produce and promote literature for all young people. Next slide. Chapter 3, Global Children's Literature. Global children's literature refers to books whose setting is outside the United States, or books published in another country and then translated, if needed, and published in the United States. Many people don't realize that children in the U.S. have been reading books in translation for more than a century. The works of Hans Christian Andersen, the Grimm's Brothers, and Perrault are all translated books. Classics in children's literature, like Pippi Longstocking, Heidi, and Pinocchio, are translated books. Next slide. An international organization that I've been actively affiliated with for more than 35 years is the International Board on Books for Young People, IBY, with headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. IBBY promotes the importance of bringing books and children together worldwide. Over 80 nations have sections in IBBY, including the U.S. We are called US-BBY. IBBY was founded shortly after World War II by Jelle Leppmann, a visionary Jewish-German woman who fled Germany in the early years of Hitler's rise to power and relocated to England. After the war, she returned to Germany and founded the International Youth Library in Munich. You can see an interior photo of the library in the slide. The International Board on Books for Young People, and Bookbird, a journal of international children's literature. Leppmann believed that children's books could be a bridge to understanding, and that children reading about children in other countries would lead to a more peaceful world. The organization today still pursues Leppmann's goals and brings books and children together in various ways around the globe. Next slide. This month, a biography of Jelle Leppmann by multiple award-winning children's author Catherine Patterson has been published in the United States. Here in the U.S., US-BBY strives to increase the number of international books published in the U.S. and promotes the use of international books in classrooms. US-BBY publishes an annual list of outstanding international books, holds conferences and special web-based programs. Today, more U.S. children are becoming aware of and reading international books and informational books. The increasing popularity of manga, the Japanese graphic novel, among middle grade students is certainly one indication. My 10-year-old grandson is a big manga fan, and he recently showed me the large manga section at a bookstore and took delight in describing many of the manga series he especially enjoys. Next slide. Chapter 4, Jewish Children's Literature. Jewish children's literature represents another kind of diverse children's literature in the U.S. As a child, I fondly remember sitting on my dad's lap as he read me the folk tales about the people of Chelm, the lovable, humorous characters who some people considered fools, while others considered sages. My mother was fluent in Yiddish and shared with me her knowledge about Yiddish literature and theater. The Jewish Caucus, established by the National Council of Teachers of English in 2002, sponsored sessions at NCTE about Jewish children's literature. Discussions with caucus members over the years led to my most recent professional book. Next slide. Enduring Questions, Using Jewish Children's Literature in Classrooms, co-authored with OSU colleagues David Bloom and Lori Katz. Our dear friend, Rosemary Horwitz, another co-author, died unexpectedly before the book was completed. This book is for all teachers, regardless of whether any of their students are Jewish, and provides information and recommendations about Jewish children's books that teachers might share with their students. It also creates a framework for children to engage in dialogue about enduring questions. One feature of the book is classroom vignettes written by teachers from across the country in all kinds of schools who describe how they shared a Jewish children's book in their classroom. Next slide. Final thoughts. This teacher's journey to bring children and books together continues. She still believes that books can open the world to children, make them laugh and cry, bring them comfort, and change their lives. She is still advocating for the right of teachers to share books with children in classrooms and the right of all children everywhere in this world to have access to quality books. I am grateful to those OSU administrators who believed in me and gave me so much opportunity here, my mentors who guided my path, my wonderful colleagues from whom I learned so much, and of course, my incredible students. I want to give a shout out to my family members who are here today, my husband Harvey, who encouraged my professional work these 50+ years, my daughter Rachel and son-in-law Brian, who drove in from Cincinnati, my brother Marty and sister-in-law Randy, and my niece Emily. Thank you again to Dean Pope Davis and the college for this honor. And thank you all for coming today or live streaming to listen to my story.
Hello, I'm Brian Warnick. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Bruce Kimball. Bruce Kimball earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College, his Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity, and his EDD with distinction from Harvard Graduate School of Education in History of Education. Before coming to Ohio State, he served as dean or instructor at Dartmouth College, at Harvard College, at Tenri University in Japan, at the University of Houston, at Yale University, and at the University of Rochester in New York. In 2007, he came to Ohio State as director of the Old School of Educational Policy and Leadership, where I met him. And then he went on to be a professor in the program in History and Philosophy of Education, where I became his colleague and friend. Professor Kimball's teaching and research originally focused on the history and nature of liberal arts education, and then extended to the history of the professions and professional education after spending 2 years at Harvard Law School as a liberal arts fellow in the mid-1980s. Over the last decade, he has been studying the history of wealth, cost, and price of colleges and universities in the United States. In 1986, Professor Kimball was awarded a Spencer Postgraduate Fellowship, and in 1998, a senior fellowship by the American Council of Learned Societies. In 2012, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He has written 10 books and over 90 articles and book chapters. Published 4 decades ago, his first book, A History of Liberal Arts Education, is still in print in English and Chinese translation and is now being translated into Korean, and is something I often recommend to my students today. Today, his legacy lecture draws from his recent book, Wealth, Cost, and Price of American Higher Education. Now, on a personal note, I count myself lucky that we were able to have Bruce in our department for the time that we did. When he arrived in 2007, he quickly became a valued colleague and friend and sounding board. I came to know him as a master teacher. His seminars in educational history remain legendary among our students and alumni, not only for their challenge and rigor and extensive reading lists, but also for Bruce's deep investment and concern for his students' work and ideas. In that time, I also came to see Bruce as someone who embodies and demonstrates why the study of humanities, history and philosophy in particular, is so important to the study of education. I found Bruce to be a man of humane letters, literae humaniores, man of humane letters, a man who always seemed to ask the right question, who knew the origin of the educational ideas we swim in, sometimes unthinkingly, and who knew how to critique and examine those ideas with both depth and rigor. In a world that attacks and devalues the humanities, Bruce stands as an example of what is best about them. I give you Bruce Kimball.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Brian, just like I wrote it up. And thank you, Dean Pope Davis, and your staff for the wonderful invitation to return here to Ohio State and present this legacy lecture. This afternoon, I would like to address the historical shift of American higher education from a so-called golden age to what I call our Bronze Age today, despite the gilding of huge endowments and palatial recreation centers and so forth. In the early 1970s, I graduated from Dartmouth College and soon began working there as an assistant dean and envisioned a career working in higher education. At the time, higher education was enjoying a period that scholars subsequently called the Golden Age, lasting from about 1950 to 1975. During the Golden Age, the future of higher education looked bright and boundless. Colleges and universities enjoyed great public esteem and political favor, and new campuses were sprouting everywhere. Virtually anyone with a PhD could find a faculty position. Imagine that. I recall my future colleague, the late Michael Olivas, a distinguished alumnus of this college and scholar of education law, saying that professors had the best job in the world. Many of us felt that way at the time. Little did I realize that the Golden Age was coming to an end just as I entered graduate school. I trust that was merely a coincidence. Anyway, 50 years later, to the utter dismay of many who began working in colleges and universities in the 1970s, public favor for the some 3,300 colleges and universities has turned sour. In particular, the wealthy elite schools are under siege, including the Big Ten universities. How and why did this happen? The shift in public opinion has lately been attributed to several factors, including changing demographics, a failure to respond to students' vocational interests, and a populist reaction against so-called wokeism in higher education. But those explanations overlook the deeper historical origins of the shift. In our recent history, Sarah Eiler, my co-author, and I, who was my PhD advisee, I'm missing a slide here, sorry, okay. In our recent history, Sarah Eiler, my co-author, who was my PhD advisee at Ohio State, and I, have argued that the shift in public opinion about higher education is rooted in four financial developments that arose in the late 19th century, unfolded during the 20th century, and ignited resentment by the early 21st century. The first development was the growth and stratification of wealth or endowment, the financial capital that is held permanently and invested to yield an annual source of income. This huge wealth, which affords the autonomy to colleges and universities, has prompted resentment. In particular, endowments are targeted because they became steeply stratified over the past century. Of the some 3,300 colleges and universities today, 1/5 own about 99% of all permanent invested funds in higher education. The top fifth includes Ohio State and every Big Ten university. The second development was the increasing hunger for revenue in higher education. Apart from endowment income, this hunger for revenue generated new forms of fundraising, as well as the pursuit of grants and government contracts. Tuition hikes also seemed to manifest the incessant drive for revenue, and prompted outrage, particularly as student debt soared. Third, the cost to produce the education for students rose dramatically. The total production cost rose much faster than the cost of living, and economists, policymakers, and politicians alternately excused or blamed higher education. Finally, the drive for revenue ignited fierce competition among the richest colleges and universities. This intense rivalry ignited resentment because these wealthy schools appeared insatiable, even as they served as exemplars and leaders of higher education. The roots of these four developments lie in the formative era of American higher education between 1870 and 1930, when the current institutional types were established. And the American economy grew at a phenomenal rate and hatched a flock of multimillionaires for the first time in American history. Upon retiring, many of these, including John D. Rockefeller, made huge donations to endowments in higher education. Some clergy and social reformers at the time complained that unethical or illegal dealings tainted the benefactions of these industrial capitalists. But the popular response at the time to that critique was, the only trouble with tainted money is taint enough of it. And this view still prevails today. Combined with state appropriations and federal land grants, the new philanthropy increased the aggregate endowment of higher education by 40 times between 1870 and 1926. This remarkable growth is exemplified in the permanent funds of the top tier of wealthy universities listed in this slide. This slide also reveals that it was not until 1920 that Harvard attained the lead among endowments that it has maintained through today, a century later. And Harvard attained that lead by focusing all its financial policies on increasing its endowment. It may seem surprising, but no other university adopted this new strategy during the formative era. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller founded the General Education Board in 1903. And over the next 15 years, Rockefeller donated to it the equivalent of $3.5 billion in today's money. Rockefeller's General Education Board focused on building the endowments in higher education. By 1929, a second tier of 19 wealthy colleges and universities had formed, as seen in this slide, which demonstrates that the stratification of financial capital was widening at that point. However, the differences among tiers of endowment size were relatively small because investing strategy was uniformly conservative and all annual yields were fairly similar. Before 1900, endowment portfolios consisted almost entirely of mortgages, promissory notes, bonds, and real estate that could be rented or farmed. During the first half of the 20th century, a few schools began allocating small fractions of their portfolios to corporate stocks, but never more than 20%. After 1950, portfolio management took three major steps to assume more risk and become more aggressive. At the same time, higher education became increasingly stratified by wealth, because many trustees and treasurers feared taking more risk, and their endowments lagged behind. First, in 1951, the Harvard treasurer raised the allocation of corporate stocks in the university's portfolio to 60% and lowered the allocation of bonds to 40%. Though this 60-40 portfolio is regarded as conventional today, even for individuals, it was revolutionary at the time. Other colleges and universities hesitated to follow, and Harvard's endowment outperformed nearly every other in the 1950s and 1960s. By 1970, Harvard had cemented its top rank, as seen in the first published listing of endowments that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 1970. The second risky step in portfolio management occurred during the early 1970s, when the Ford Foundation encouraged colleges and universities to replace value stocks of large companies paying high dividends with growth stocks of small companies with high potential for growth. This risky strategy of growth stocks yielded massive returns in the 1980s and 1990s. However, most colleges still held back. For example, most land-grant institutions were very conservative and still primarily invested in bonds, way back to the beginning of the 20th century, 70 years earlier. Endowment portfolios that included growth stocks surged ahead. Third, in the 1990s, Yale University began to invest in extremely risky alternative assets, which include hedge funds, private equity, and natural resources. An investor must wait several years, even decades, for alternative assets to yield returns. And the risk is much greater than stocks, but so is the reward. Boosted by these aggressive strategies, rich schools became richer ever faster, and higher education became more steeply stratified by wealth. By 2023, the largest endowments became huge. Of the some 3,300 colleges and universities today, the top 25 have endowments exceeding $7 billion. And these 25 own about half of all the endowment in higher education. Even as endowment size and annual yield rapidly increased, at least for the wealthiest and most aggressive, colleges and universities hungered for more revenue throughout the 20th century. Three kinds of revenue mattered most: fundraising, government grants and subsidies, and tuition. We are so accustomed to fundraising today that it is hard to imagine a time when colleges and universities did not publicly and regularly, annually even, solicit donations. But through the 19th century, most fundraising consisted of private, personal appeals to wealthy individuals. And this practice continued through the formative era, as did Fisk University, by sending its famous Jubilee singers to serenade wealthy donors. It was only in the 1890s that Yale invented the annual alumni fund. By 1930, about 150 colleges and universities had started annual alumni funds, including many state universities, such as Ohio State in 1927. Meanwhile, inspired by initiatives at women's colleges, Harvard alumni in 1915 introduced the first national multi-year public fundraising campaign. It was an amazement to everyone. But this new model of fundraising spread rapidly. Within 5 years, by 1920, at least 75 colleges and universities were running public campaigns modeled on the Harvard campaign. And they were looking for more than $3 billion collectively in today's money. By 1930, the now conventional fundraising triad in higher education had emerged. And eventually, every school added a how to donate link on its webpage. Then in the 1950s, another new revenue source arose when huge federal grants and contracts began to flow to universities after World War II. However, the bulk of this federal grant funding during the Golden Age went to only about 25 elite universities. And the grants primarily supported basic research in defense, medicine, and advanced natural sciences. Most of the federal grants did not directly support the production cost of educating students, particularly undergraduates. The strongest continuing source of direct government support for production cost of educating students was subsidies by states, beginning in the 1870s. However, after a century, the proportion of revenue received from state subsidies started to decrease during the 1970s and continued to fall for the next 4 decades, as shown in this slide. In order to cover the shortfall, tuition and fees rose inexorably after 1980 in public colleges and universities. As a result, the burden of paying the production cost of public higher education shifted from taxpayers to individual students, as economists have observed. While public colleges and universities saw the proportion of state subsidies decline, private colleges and universities faced the problem of discounting tuition. Tuition has always paid less than half of the expenses to produce students' education, and usually less than a third. Before 1970, all students paid the full list price of tuition, even if partly through a funded scholarship. In any case, schools received all the tuition revenue that they charged, as depicted in this slide. Then came the steep inflation of the 1970s, when the relative value of all subsidies declined. Listed tuition, or price, soared to compensate. In order to maintain enrollments, private colleges and universities, for the first time, began to discount tuition in the 1970s. That is, they strategically cut the price for selected students whom they wished to enroll. During the 1980s and subsequently, tuition discounting proliferated rapidly. Due to this discounting in the private sector and to the proportional decline of state subsidies in the public sector, many colleges and universities began to struggle financially in the early 1980s. Just at that point, I emerged from graduate school. Like a groundhog coming out of his winter den, expecting sunshine, and got a day like today. I found that the golden age had ended. Even the wealthiest schools were cutting budgets and deferring maintenance. The job market was fierce, and I could not find a job during 1981-82. I interviewed at Ohio State in 1981-82, but you hired somebody else and broke my heart. No hard feelings, but why did you do it? Nevertheless, my mentors from graduate school were steadfast, particularly David Reisman, who helped me find a tenure-track position in the late 1980s at the University of Rochester, which had an endowment in the top 10 in the nation, but was discounting tuition at about 42% to attract undergraduates. Schools do not like to divulge their discount rates, so the data is incomplete. But it is clear that discount rates continue to grow in the 21st century, as seen in this slide. The golden age was but a memory, and discounting tuition was no solution, because the more schools raised the list price of tuition, the more they had to discount in order to attract students. Consequently, average net tuition paid by students held steady, as seen in this slide. Discounting schools were therefore caught in a whipsaw. Hikes in list tuition spawned widespread criticism. Yet students on average were not paying more in tuition, and schools were not receiving more tuition revenue. But wait, if average net tuition was not increasing, why were students paying more to attend and accruing more debt? The primary reason is that ancillary expenses for students, such as room, board, technology, recreation, even parking, grew much faster than the cost of living, because schools were providing more expensive amenities and facilities to recruit students. And then students had to pay more for these ancillary expenses in addition to tuition. Apart from the total price that students were paying, the total production costs that schools were bearing grew even faster, because colleges and universities were also expanding their administration and support services much faster than the cost of living. These included such things as legal staff, administrative staff, maintenance, security, career services, counseling services, and other support services. I actually looked back at Dartmouth College, where I was an assistant dean 50 years ago, and I looked up and there was one college lawyer. If you had a legal problem, you called the college lawyer and got some legal advice. I looked back there just last week, and you know what? Dartmouth College now has 10 full-time lawyers and 5 paralegals. That costs a lot of money, and it all goes into the total production cost. Consequently, the total per-student production cost of higher education has been rising much faster than the cost of living since 1970. The trend continued in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, as seen in this slide. So, why do colleges continue to increase both ancillary expenses charged to students as well as ancillary costs in administration and support services? The fundamental and generally accepted explanation is twofold. On the one hand, colleges and universities have acted like most charitable, ecclesiastical, and social service organizations. They believe that their financial need is infinite because more revenue can always be put to good use. On the other hand, in addition to that benign motive, competition for prestige and influence drive the insatiable need for more funding. As a vice president of Cornell University wrote in the year 2000, every college and university is engaged in the equivalent of an arms race of spending to improve its absolute quality and its relative status in the prestige pecking order. This arms race is most intense among the wealthiest schools. Their elite status has then stoked the competition for revenue throughout higher education, leading total production costs to grow faster than the cost of living. Taken together, the immense growth and widening stratification of endowments, the incessant fundraising, the steep hikes in listed tuition, and the ever-expanding production cost ignited vocal public resentment for the first time during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Now, one might dismiss this criticism as politically motivated, but Sarah Eiler and I have found that public approval of higher education began to decline sharply, apart from partisan politics. At the beginning of the 21st century, bipartisan congressional committees began to scrutinize the rising wealth, price, and cost of higher education. Then in 2017, Congress imposed an unprecedented excise tax on the endowment income of the wealthiest private nonprofit colleges and universities. In 2023, the latest data, 56 schools were subject to the tax and paid about $380 million in excise taxes. This political outcome resulted from the public resentment that had been building against higher education, especially the leading elite wealthy institutions over the prior 4 decades, while the wealth concentration in higher education came to exceed the wealth concentration in the general population. Let me repeat that. The wealth concentration in higher education came to exceed the wealth concentration in the general population. Nevertheless, Sarah and I lament the excise tax because we believe that those 56 schools could spend the $380 million more efficiently and effectively than the federal government. And we have argued that this excise tax could have been prevented if the wealthy schools had rebuilt the public esteem and political favor that they once enjoyed. How could they do that? Sarah and I propose that the richest schools should end their financial arms race and adopt a new financial strategy of cooperating rather than competing, and share their endowment income with needful school systems, colleges, and universities such as HBCUs. We argue that ending the financial arms race is in the long-term self-interest of the wealthy elites because it would rebuild public esteem and political favor and prevent further excise taxes. A few schools have begun to do this, such as the University of Pennsylvania. But it is reported that many wealthy schools today are trying to cultivate political favor by hiring more lobbyists in Washington, D.C. This response seems wrong-headed and does not address the fundamental problem of the arms race for revenue and spending over the last 50 years. And that is why I call our current era the Gilded Bronze Age of higher education. Thank you.
So we're going to engage in a little bit of Q&A. And we're going to begin with some general questions. And then we're going to open it up to the audience to ask them specific questions that they might have or seek some level of clarification. So here's the first one. Although you are both technically retired, you remain actively involved in projects at the university and with other collaborators around the country. Could you share a bit about what you are currently working on?
Certainly. So I'm still quite actively involved in various roles with the International Board on Books for Young People and USBBY. I am doing some reviews of children's books for several journals and working on several projects dealing with Jewish children's literature, as well as representing the emeritus faculty on the Faculty Compensation and Benefits Committee.
Maybe there's money from the endowment in that, right?
Thank you, Dean. I'm continuing to work on these issues of finance and the critiques on higher education, and have turned to writing a number of op-ed pieces on it. Even as I was working on this lecture, it was amazing how much you all see attacks on higher education and suggestions and criticism of the finances continue to come rolling out. So that's kept me pretty busy.
Your work for both of you has undeniably had a tremendous impact in your respective fields and been fulfilling personally as given by what you've said today. What advice do you have for the emerging scholars about this aspect of the academy, particularly in today's environment?
You can go first.
Well, this was history. It had a lot of sort of finance stuff in it. But I think, as Brian alluded to, that I feel it's critical for the humanities to continue to flourish within higher education and within the field of education. And I am actually contemplating a book on sort of a defense of the liberal arts, and particularly the humanities. So I guess what I would recommend to those working in graduate school and so on would be to fight the good fight, as it were.
Develop partnerships.
What?
Develop partnerships.
Yes. And I think within the philosophy and history of education program, I think the graduate students have a close camaraderie that I think supports each other.
Do you want to take
I think it's a very challenging environment. So I think it's really important for people who are going into higher ed to find joy in what they're doing, to care about what they're doing and believe in it. And if you really are passionate about your work and your research and your writing, then hopefully that helps buttress you a little against all the challenges that higher ed is facing today, and public education, which of course many of us have been involved in and care deeply about.
If I could add to that, I think I've told a number of PhD students I've had over the years that sometimes students will do their dissertations because there's funding in that area, or someone told them it was a hot area, or they're anticipating it's going to be a hot area. And so I don't believe that works. I believe what you have to do is kind of like Dewey, and you have to follow the intrinsic interest, your intrinsic interest. And if you feel something is interesting to you, it's going to feel that way to other people. There is a population out there. You don't need to worry about going into the hot field at the time, or necessarily chasing the funding. You've got to work out of intrinsic interest in doing something.
And so in working out that intrinsic interest, from your perspective, how do you do that while the platform underneath it continues to pivot in a different direction? How do you maintain that enthusiasm and that commitment, given the need to have resources to do that quality of work?
Well, there's no easy answer. But, I mean, what I also feel is that, outside, I think a lot of the public looks at being a professor as kind of a cushy and easy job, but it's a very tough profession to be successful at. And tenacity and resilience are fundamental. There are going to be difficult times. There are going to be difficult times. Like I told the year I was unemployed. There was actually another year I was employed. I spent 2 different years unemployed. And boy, it grinds at you. It grinds at you. And you've got to be resilient. You've got to believe in yourself. That's the importance of the intrinsic interest. So there's going to be tough times, but I think if you are tenacious and you're doing good work and working hard, it will turn out.
Yeah, I agree with everything Bruce said and about the intrinsic interest. If you really believe in what you're doing and you believe it's important work and you care about that work, then that helps you, that sustains you. I also think it's really important to develop strong relationships with colleagues and with peers and with people outside of higher education, outside of your field, because they can support you in other ways and help you find balance in your life, so that although your work may be challenging and difficult and have many stresses, if there are other supports that you have in your life that can balance you and give you the equilibrium you need to keep fighting, as Bruce said, the good fight.
Okay. What emerging trends or innovations in education excite both of you the most? What challenges in the field keeps you up at night? And what issues allows you to sleep better?
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Wow. Well.
Start anywhere.
Start anywhere.
Well, I think the attacks, frankly, on higher education by, frankly, people who, in my view, are kind of ignorant. They don't understand what they're talking about. Because I think education is so critical, obviously, to human growth and human flourishing. And higher education, of course, is part of that. So that's what keeps me up at night or worrying. And
innovation?
What?
Innovation in higher education?
Innovation?
Yes.
You mean as a solution?
Yes.
Sure. Of course, I'm a historian, a humanist. So I'm probably not as innovative as some. Evie would be. One thinks about digital kind of accommodations and things like that.
AI.
Yes, yeah. And I think there's certain AI and such. There's certainly a role for that as well.
So I'd kind of like to focus on public education. Is that
right.
okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Since that's my area. So I think what really keeps me up at night is, again, the attacks on public education and the attacks on teachers and the increase in legislation that is trying to tell teachers and other personnel in schools that are working with kids how to do their job, not really respecting teachers as a profession and believing that teachers can decide what's best for their own students. So that's one thing that keeps me up. And of course, as a children's literature person, book banning is very distressing, and that definitely also keeps me up at night. An innovation in public education that is reassuring is the development of all the assisted technologies that are helping children with disabilities. So now there are so many more opportunities for children with various kinds of learning disabilities and other kinds of disabilities to be very successful because of the assisted technologies that are now available to them.
If I may just elaborate.
Absolutely.
When I said about, well, these critics and they're ignorant and whatnot, to clarify, what I really mean is, well, no. The problem is it's viewing
recorded,
education
by the
as
way.
short-term ends. It's a utilitarian view of education at the what kind of a job are you going to get at the end of your 4 years? And what education is about, fundamental, I think, is, as I said, human flourishing. That is trying to lead a fruitful, happy life, fulfilling life in the long run.
Yeah.
And as a proponent of liberal arts, I think it's in the long run that those kind of studies of the humanities come back to you. And reading, how do you quantify the value, the dollar value of books that you give to have little kids read? That's not manifested for decades. So it's kind of like an appreciation. This is what keeps me up. It's an appreciation of what education really is that I feel is lacking.
You make reference to the liberal arts, the life of the mind.
Yes.
Is the notion of that. How do we inculcate and enhance that perspective in the current environment? What do you see as potential starting points or engagement in that conversation?
Well, frankly, I think, if I'm going to say it, I think Evie's kind of work is critical for establishing the appreciation of the life of the mind.
Meaning you need to
Very
learn,
early in children's
you
literature.
need to learn to read.
What?
You need to learn to read.
Yes, you need to learn to read, but you also need to learn good books worth reading, as it were. And I think Evie really, what she's doing, her work is so foundational, because I think once children come to appreciate that, I believe that never goes away. It will continue, and that's, so it's like you say about the life. How do we inculcate the life of an appreciation of the life of the mind? It's through early children's literature, but also the books that we require and have people read all the way along. Throughout their education.
I recall briefly in my own education of faculty insisting that we read the great books. Some of you may remember that when you, and so the question would be, what would be the great books of today? What would be that reference point? Because that period has shifted a bit. So to simplify the question, what books would you suggest in the current environment that we should read? Just pick one or two.
You mean like in higher education?
Yes, yes.
Well, I'd still go back to John Dewey.
Okay.
Just go back to John Dewey.
No, I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead.
that's all, yeah.
No, I taught in a great books program at the University of Houston honors program when that was like my first job. After you people didn't fight, after you didn't hire me.
We didn't fight to
But
keep
I've
you.
forgotten that. No, don't worry. And it was so enriching, and I think that great books with a much broader canon are still speak to us today. And I was involved in a education program for prisoners in Massachusetts state prisons, and some of these prisoners, they were in there for life terms and everything, didn't have much education, but you could have them read a dialogue of Plato about Socrates and the fundamental question about what is justice that you see Socrates talking about, and it kind of draws you in. And then, of course, there's W.E.B. Du Bois and so on. I think texts that are sort of great, if you will, or classical, continue to speak to people in many different contexts, and for generations to come. And have.
So in both of your discussions, you mentioned shifts over time that have influenced your respective fields of study. What has been the most significant or impactful shift, whether positive or negative, that you've seen in your work?
Could you mean a shift, like a shift of the kind of thing?
Shift in the fields, shift in society, things that you would historically have seen as important as part of the pedagogical engagement in higher education.
Yeah.
I think in the area of children's literature, the whole area of visual literacy and children becoming more visually oriented in terms of the screens, in terms of graphic novels, which are heavily illustrated books. So I think children's focus has shifted, and children are more interested in visual things. And so I think as educators, we need to try to figure out how to harness that, how to use that in a positive way, and also try to continue to encourage the written word, that everything isn't just on a screen or visual, that the written word is still important. So finding that balance of how to respond to children's desire for more visual things at the same time that we want to help them be readers and writers of text, written text.
Of course, in my talk, I talked about the shift from the golden age to what happened. And I was ruminating, I think that the deeper lesson there is that context determines a lot. Context shapes a lot of your own professional fortunes and your work in ways that you don't even see at the time. I've been a dean at several different schools, and what I was always impressed by is that faculty who came out of PhD programs and went right into research university tenure track positions, which I did not, they thought the meritocracy worked, right? They think, oh yeah, this is the way it's supposed to work. It works this way, right? But that's very tricky. For me, it didn't work coming out, right? And that leads you to doubt yourself. But you also have to think about what is the context. We were talking about the finances at this university and how they shift. And people seem to, you succeed when there's a lot of money, right? And you struggle when the money goes down. But it's not, you are not failing or necessarily succeeding. I mean, you can do better or worse, but there's a lot of the context that determines your life outcomes and your professional success. And I guess that's what that happens to us all in life. But that's what made
Yeah,
me
yeah,
think about
yeah.
the shifts.
Bruce, I'm going to start this question with you. Given your desire to be at Ohio State, and we were to hire you today, since we missed the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, now we're getting down to it.
What would you want to teach? And don't look at Brian.
No, no. I would want to teach, history and philosophy of education, particularly higher education. Because I find it. I wish I was just starting my career now, because now I feel like now I know how to do it, right? And I could do it much better. So I don't have any regrets about that at all. I really would like to teach the same area and continue. I mean, I think about books I'd like to do and like to do now, and things that are gripping. So.
Okay. Evie, given what you know now, what would you do?
Oh, I'd want to teach the same things I taught before. Courses in children's literature and elementary language arts. I love teaching them then.
Would you do it any differently?
Oh yeah, well yes. I think the world's changed, and teacher ed has changed, and so I would need to, change some things about the way I taught those courses, because teachers are going into schools that are different than they were when I began. So I would have to modify some things to make sure I was preparing those teachers in the best possible way to enter today's classroom, to be language arts teachers and share children's literature in their classrooms. Don't ask me exactly what I would change, because I'd have to think about that. That would take time to work through, but yeah.
Yeah, one last question before we give the audience a chance. So, knowing what you know now, what would you have told your younger self when you started? What advice would you have given your younger self, given where you are in your career?
Well, because when I went through a lot of travail early in my career and floundering, and that is a difficult period. So I guess I would assure myself it's going to turn out all right. It's when you work hard and you're trying so to do good work. It's as I said, it goes back to that tenacity and resilience. It's so.
Yeah, I think I would tell my younger self to not give up, to keep going forward, and to try to be true to yourself and believe in yourself. I think that's probably what I would tell my younger self.
Right, thank you. Questions from the audience. If you're going to speak up, we have a microphone here that we can pass to you.
I don't need a mic.
All right. Well, we've got people online.
Oh, okay.
We've got people online, so.
Well, this is a little unformed of a question, but have you had any feelings like you're such an old fart and the culture's changing in ways that actually make you glad you're retired?
Well, usually it has to do with an engagement with technology of some kind. And also both of my kids, young adults now, are kind of engaged with artificial intelligence in various realms. And I think it's just going to be so transformational. And it kind of scares me. But I guess, so I do share that, Patty. I do share that feeling. I would be thinking I would need to retool myself in artificial intelligence to try to figure out what's going on.
Even in history, artificial intelligence is retooling.
Yeah, to fend it off. But you know, I don't know if we touched, if there was Dean asked such great questions, but you know, one thing that changed radically, maybe this will go back to transformation, is the digital access to archives. Is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, when I started out, you had to go into an archive and sort through it and figure it out. And it's going into an archive and figuring out the filing system and everything else is very difficult. And now you can virtually access any student newspaper that was ever printed. Not actually any newspaper that was ever printed in the United States, you can access digitally now. And also any student newspaper at any college or university, you can sit at your desk and access it. And those are, you know, like original sources, obviously. So it's just, I mean, that's an example of what's transformed. So that's been salutary.
Do you want to take a shot at the question?
All right, so well, I retired as a dean, and so I am grateful and admire those people who are still in administration, because being a dean in higher education today is a very, very, very challenging field. And there's just a lot to deal with politically that in terms of the state legislature and the federal government that I did not have to, I mean, I had to deal with politics, everybody has to deal, but the challenges to higher ed, as Bruce was saying, the dean was saying, the challenges to higher ed and the public perception about higher ed, I think have made being an administrator very difficult, and I really admire all those people who are still trying to do it. I admire them very much.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. Imagine a nefarious person puts your entire scholarly corpora into a burning building, and it'll be lost irrevocably.
Your entire scholarly...
Yeah, your entire scholarly corpora, your work,
okay.
into a burning building, and you can only save one piece from being lost
In time.
in time. What one piece from your past would you go and save, and why?
Oh my goodness. One?
Actually, I broached this question recently with my dear wife, and it was generated partly by thinking about this, is my first book on the history of liberal arts was sort of most well known, but I wrote a biography of the most prominent legal educator in the history of legal education, which is Christopher Columbus Langdell. And he transformed education, legal pedagogy and graduate school pedagogy. And I wrote a biography of him that was based on, you know, original work, and in little libraries here and there. I mean, they're probably not digitized yet. And I'm sort of I would want to save that, because I think it won't be duplicated, as it were.
Yeah, it's a hard question, but I think I'd probably save my first edited book, which was using nonfiction trade books in the elementary classroom, from ants to zeppelins. I think I'd save that for a couple of reasons. It was an edited book, but it was a book that I was very new in the field. It was new. I was a younger professor, and I worked with such wonderful people. Colleagues from across the country, and it's a new field. It was an emerging field. Not hardly anything had been written about nonfiction, and it started me on a path that was very meaningful to me for a long time. So I think I'd probably save that book.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is for both of you. What would you say to those who would like very much to delete the college, the federal Department of Education?
Oh my goodness. Pat, really? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's hard to know what to say. I was ruminating about how one could construct a constitutional argument for a right about a right to education, and whether that would be included in sort of rights for property almost. You know, your driver's license. Okay, so you have the right, you have a license to drive, right? It used to be regarded as a privilege that the state granted to you. And then in about 1981, there was a Supreme Court case that said, no, driver's license is property. Okay, and the state can't take away your property because it's under the property clause of the US Constitution. So it seems to me there's got to be ways, it's so manifest that education is a right and an obligation of the state that there's got to be a way to make a constitutional argument. I mean, I'm not a constitutional scholar, I'm just ruminating, but so the Department of Education is obviously needed at a federal level.
So I would say, you know, what is more important than the education of children? What is more important to a democracy than having children who can read and write and think for themselves and make good decisions and understand the world? What is more important than that? And at a federal level, don't we want all school districts in the country to have certain laws and legislation that all children, children with disabilities, children in urban settings and rural settings that don't have a lot of money, don't we want all of those children to have the same opportunities in our country? So we need some kind of body, some kind of organization that can preserve the right of all children across our country to have a free, public, quality education.
Okay, we have to wrap up. One last question from anyone? Hearing none, please give our guests a round of applause.
Thank you.
I want to thank you both for being with us
Thank you.
for this
Thank
great
you. Thank you
opportunity.
so much.
Before you leave, we have a gift for each of you.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, that's great.
Oh,
Thank you. You can invest this in an endowment if you want.
Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much.
Absolutely.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.